Afternoon and welcome back for session 2 of our Business Beyond Borders program and reshoring topic. If you joined us last week, we had an overview of the global supply chain and the impact of COVID. And we also touched on a new reshoring tool that we will go over more in depth today. My name is Carrie Broderson, and I'm the Vice President of Events and Business Resource Groups at the Greater Houston Partnership. Welcome. Enjoy having you back today. If you have any questions at all for our guests, our speakers today, please do submit those in the Q&A tab rather than the chat feature. The chat feature will reserve for resources and links and any technical issues or comments that you have. But few questions for the speakers today that we'll be able to ask at the end. If you can put those in the Q&A feature, that would be very helpful. Also, in the chat feature, there'll be some information if you want to learn more about the Greater Houston Partnership, today's Business Beyond Borders program, or any of our programming, as well as information about other events that we have at the Greater Houston Partnership. So those links will be in your chat feature. Again, thanks for being with us today. And if you joined us last week, you'll know that the recording of last week's event is available for viewing. We did send out a follow-up, but if you did not receive that, please send in your question through the chat feature and let my teammate know that you did not get that, and we'll make sure you do. So today we're going to run through a quick recap of last week's session and also answer some of the questions that we were not able to get to last week due to time. Hopefully we'll get to all of those for you today. And then we will dive deeper into the TCO estimator and ultimately companies' readiness factor for reshoring. And we appreciate you all being here today and following up on last week's presentation. I do want to say thank you to our supporting organizations, the Beehive Fund and TMAC Gulf Coast, for supporting today's event, for also reaching out to some of their audiences to let them know about this topic. So thank you again. And today I'd like to reintroduce two of our speakers that are rejoining us. Dr. Sanju Patro is Director of TMAC Gulf Coast and also co-founder of the Beehive Fund. And we also have Harry Moser, who's founder and president of the Reshoring Initiative. For more information and biographical information on our speakers today, we'll have those links in the chat feature, and make sure you're also getting that information in any follow-up information. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, if you have any questions for our speakers, please put them in the Q&A feature. If you have any technical issues, or you just want to communicate with my teammates who are behind the scenes right now, please do put those in the chat feature. So let's go ahead and get started. Sanju, if you'd like to kick us off.
Recap of last session for those of you who are joining us for the first time today. We talked briefly about the Made in America Executive Order to strengthen Buy American provisions. Carrie, would you please click onto the next slide? We talked about the Made in America Executive Order and how it impacts manufacturing in this country. We talked about how MEP centers provide assistance primarily to small and medium-sized manufacturing businesses to help them improve their productivity and competitiveness. We discussed the role of MEP in supporting American manufacturing and supplier matching, scouting, optimization, and risk mitigation services that MEP provides to these manufacturers. And then Harry discussed the $800 billion a year goods trade deficit that the US has. He explained that the deficit is driven by US manufacturing costs, often being about 20 to 40% higher than in Europe or low wage countries such as China. And he also explained how our high cost is due to an overvalued US dollar, lack of skilled workforce training, and historically high corporate tax rates, also a lack of value-added tax. And encouragingly, he pointed out how despite these problems, millions of jobs could be reshored if companies all use TCO, total cost of ownership, instead of price when they're making sourcing decisions for components and products. And so, to help us get started bringing these jobs back today, Harry will provide a deep dive into TCO later in the session. So, I'd like to briefly address a few questions that we missed out from part one. We couldn't cover all the questions, but we picked a few to address now. And if you have more questions, you're welcome to contact us. First question I have here is from Carlos. Carlos says, I'm currently studying computer science, but I hope to apply that knowledge to manufacturing. What skills are most sorely needed in the manufacturing industry? Well, Carlos, I believe the future of manufacturing is digital. As we trend more and more towards a digital and connected world, I think software applications are going to become very ubiquitous in all aspects of manufacturing. And I urge you to look into smart manufacturing and smart factory technologies such as industrial Internet of Things, robotics, and cybersecurity. And threat monitoring tools will be in demand, I think, to prevent cyber attacks. Also, data analysis is becoming a very important field in manufacturing. Manufacturing analytical dashboards, collaboration tools. These are just some examples of applications that I see in a manufacturing environment that you could pursue. Also, keep your eye out on revolutionary new concepts such as transportation as a service. I think these are inevitable and it's coming very fast. In a few years, I envision uh, individuals, families like us will not be owning cars. We won't have garages. The dealerships as we know it will disappear. What's going to happen is autonomous or driverless vehicle production is going to increase, and we're going to be using apps to order transportation services. So keep this in mind as you think about what's going to come in the future of manufacturing. All these technologies need software applications. So I think you're in a very good and interesting field with a lot of prospects. So I'm going to read out another question. This is from Robert. Robert says, in the spirit of your conversation about nearby sourcing, how does the raw metals materials sit today? For example, metals for ONG market parts. Robert, if we are talking iron, steel, or manufactured goods that are not produced in the United States in sufficient quantities or they're not reasonable, they're very unreasonably expensive or costly to buy in the US, well, obviously you have no choice but to buy it from a foreign country. But in that case, it makes sense to near source such materials. The shorter the distance, the better, because the longer distances mean higher lead times, and the longer lead times mean more inventory that you're going to keep. And this means excessive inventory costs. So, of course, you want to buy this from a country next door rather than from across the oceans if possible. Another question I'm going to read out from Gauri. Is there a deficit in some manufacturing sectors where we could fill the gap? And I would ask Harry to answer this question. Harry, would you please? Is there a deficit in some manufacturing sectors where we could fill the gap? Harry, you're muted.
Muted, that's not
There you
good,
go.
huh? Okay, thank you. I wasn't before. There we go.
You're good now. We hear you.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So very good question. President Biden's announced last week that the country is going to act very aggressively to fill the gaps in PPE, medical protective material, pharmaceuticals, rare earth, chips, a broad range of things like that. So will the gap be filled in those areas? I say yes, because the country is willing to spend tens of billions of dollars to make sure the gaps are filled. So those would seem to be good sectors to be in. But I'm convinced that we also can fill other categories that are not too labor intensive or where the freight cost is high relative to the labor cost. So examples, machined and plastic parts, chemicals, steel and aluminum, things like that, where where labor isn't too high relative to freight. Okay.
Another question, I think, Harry, you would be best answering this. The question from Ruben is, what commodities are easier to reshore or have a biggest demand to be reshored?
Yeah, continuing on from what I said in the last question, the high ratio of freight costs to labor costs, automatable. If you can get the labor costs down to a small percentage of the total, then the wage difference doesn't make much difference. Things that have a seasonal or volatile demand. Why? Because product coming out of, say, China or India might take 6 weeks or 8 weeks to get here. And from your factory, 50 miles away, it could be an hour or maybe a week or 2 weeks, including production. So that says that if the product is seasonal or volatile, local makes a lot of sense. Frequent design changes make sense because not so much time waiting for prototypes to go back and forth. High IP risks, products that have safety risks. So there's been times when the consumer has aggressively sought made in USA product for anything that was, say, used by the baby, because they didn't want the baby to be subject to the risk of something coming in from a third world country that wasn't as careful as we are. Lots of opportunities.
Thank you, Harry. I think we should get moving with our presentation portion now. Harry, would you go on with your presentation?
Yes, I will. I'm gonna share and get that up to there. How is that? Can you see it okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Someday we'll have an avatar that reads our mind and it changes it all automatically for us. Maybe the fellow who called in or with the question could handle that for us. So I'm going to review, I've got about 50 slides, and I agreed with Sanju that only 10 of them would be repeats from the first presentation. So you'll see a few, but those are the few that I thought were necessary to set the stage and tie everything together. So you'll forgive me for a little bit of repeats. So the key thing here is that the COVID crisis has shown us the shortages, the lack of self-sufficiency, the problem of the US not being able to take care of itself in so many areas, like masks, gowns, and gloves, rare earth minerals, 5G, a lot of almost all apparel, a lot of defense products, et cetera. So there's just a significant problem that society has started to recognize, and that recognition is making it easier to bring the work back. The residual problem is that companies make almost all their decisions based on price or on other things driven by price, like the product is no longer made here. You hear that fairly often. And so we say about 70% of the decision to whether to buy here or offshore or make here or offshore is driven by price rather than other considerations like quality, availability, delivery, et cetera, et cetera. And the price difference, as Sanju, I think, mentioned, was that the US is maybe 20% higher than Europe and 40% higher than China, India, places like that. And that's a huge difference. So companies from that conclude the US is too expensive. I ought to import everything. I shouldn't get anything here. And we say, no, not if they use TCO. So as was mentioned, TCO, total cost of ownership, is the accurate measurement system, as opposed to looking at wages, ex works price or FOB price or landed cost. And so, but it's hard. It's not easy. And I recognize it's not easy for companies, because if they're comparing an offshore source to a domestic or local source, in terms of price, the offshore source has the advantage. But in terms of risk, the risk is high. The balance sheet implications, like inventory, are negative. They will be less customer responsive. They will lack. There'll be an impact on innovation. So you have local having a big disadvantage on price, and then everything else having all the other measurements are a disadvantage for offshoring. So how do you put all that together? How do you add risk to price, to lack of innovation, and come up with an answer? That's a difficult question. And so we say use total cost of ownership. So the TCO system, the TCO estimator, which is free online on our website, includes hard factors and softer or risks like strategic factors. So the hard factors would include the freight, normal duties, the travel costs to check on the supplier, the packaging, the inventory carrying costs. Many companies would say 20, 25%, even in a time of low interest rates. The ability to do just in time, to bring the product from the vendor right to the factory floor, never even having to put it on the inventory shelf. And then risks and strategic factors like emergency air freight, very, very expensive right now because so many of the planes are not flying. The ability for engineering and manufacturing to get together and optimize the product and the process, the risk of stocking out, cybersecurity, quality differentials, all these things, many of which might only be 0.5% or 1%, but since there's 28 of these factors, collectively they can be 15, 25%, and therefore need to be considered. So again, this is a representation of the TCO estimator, and I showed you this last time. The Chinese price was 70, US was 100. Easy decision, get it out of China, but for TCO it was 98 and 108. And in a couple of years, China TCO higher. So hopefully the company, if they do the TCO, which is my job and your job to get them to do that, they will decide not to use the China sourcing. So here's a new slide, and this shows the output of the TCO estimator. So what this does, it starts again with that 70 price from China and 100 from the US. You can see this big gap here. And then as we add in increasingly soft factors, so we go from price to cost of goods sold, price, duty, freight, packaging, something like that. And then other hard or cash costs like the carrying cost of inventory. It costs you money to keep inventory tied up. Risks such as emergency air freight, intellectual property risk, et cetera. Strategic impacts like the ability to customize the product easily for the marketplace. So the purpose of this is to show within your company or within your prospective customer's company that of the closing of the gap from this big gap to maybe that small gap, how much of that occurs in the hard or firm costs that everybody pretty much will agree with, and then not too much of it is taking place in the softer things where reasonable people could have very different opinions on the intellectual property risk, the political instability risk, natural disaster risk, COVID risk, things like that. So some of the advantages of using TCO, it's customized. I've seen sheets or proposals come out from various industry groups, and they'll say blah, 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 30% difference, something like that. And it's just one number, and it's supposed to be one size fits all, and that's not reasonable, and most companies will not accept that. That's why we customized it or provided the tool for you to customize it to your case, for your company or for your customer's company. All the values that go into it are user selected, except we have basically have freight costs, air and surface freight costs built into the system. It's standardized, it's credible, so it's not you on the back of an envelope or you on a spreadsheet. It's the Reshoring Initiative, which has been doing this for 10 years and is very well recognized by the Commerce Department and other groups in the country. It's got freight rates from 17 countries, and if it doesn't have the country you're interested in, let's say it has Vietnam but not Cambodia, well, use Vietnam because it's got to be about the same. It comes up with the current TCO value and a 5-year forecast of the TCO. So you can do, like I showed you in that couple of charts back, how close it has become now and how maybe China or the other country will be higher within a couple of years. It's got all kinds of explanations and references. And when we get to when I open up the system, you see it, you'll understand that it's free. It can't be less expensive than that, and it is powerful. So again, this chart shows the first 180 cases of China versus the U.S., where I took those cases and plotted in blue the Chinese FOB price as a percentage of the U.S. FOB price, Here's the percentages down here. So at 100, the two are equal. And you can see the mode is up here around 72. And about 8% of the cases, the US had a price advantage, whereas for the exact same cases with TCO, the US won 32% of the time. And if there happened to be a 46% Trump tariff in place, then 46% of the time. So just by doing the measurement correctly and recognizing whether there happens to be a tariff, and they look like the tariffs are going to stay on China for a reasonable period of time, makes a huge difference in whether it's feasible to bring work back to the United States. This table shows a range of other groups that have done looked into the the magnitude of these hidden costs, which are the difference between the FOB price and the total cost. They're hidden because most companies choose to ignore them. And depending on who it's done the study and what group they'd study, it comes out somewhere in the 15 to 25% range that that by doing TCO, you can offset that much of the price differential. Many of you may know Deming, who said stop buying on the basis of price, instead minimize total cost. Most people respect the work that he's done. Most companies ignore this aspect of it. So to give you a couple of cases of this, there's a glass wall company. They make those glass blocks you make walls out in the Bay Area in California, and Manex, which is the MEP up in Northern California, worked with them, and the company was about to move from the Bay Area down to Mexico, and Manex used TCO and showed them that all the costs that they'd be picking up by moving to Mexico. They concluded that that would significantly offset the direct labor savings, and finally they decided to move into a larger facility in the Bay Area. So the TCO definitely won on that. Here's an electronics company, video products, and they did a TCO evaluation that convinced them that US was a better choice for them than offshore. And I told you about this last time. This is my favorite case where this Mori Corp that makes printed circuit boards used TCO to convince their biggest customer not to leave them and buy from a Chinese supplier, and that and using TCO was the key to winning a $60 million order. So, I'd be delighted to help you win $1 million order or a $500,000 order. So the purposes of TCO are for the bigger companies, the companies that make the importing decisions to buy and site meaning where do I place the next facility? So to buy and site smarter. For the suppliers, the SME, the supply chain companies, to sell smarter, convincing the OEMs to use TCO and to recognize these cost differentials. And I point out it's applicable in all countries. Now the freight in it is built into the US. It's in dollars. It's in pounds of weight. But if you're in Mexico and if you're willing to do it in dollars, the freight to Mexico is got to be about the same as it is from China to Chicago. So in many ways you can certainly use the logic, and in many ways you can use the actual tool itself. I have like a triaging system, I call it here, where if a company comes to me and they say, Harry, what should we do first? Yeah, I'm interested. We believe in TCO. We'd like to make the right decisions. What do we do? I say, first, do not offshore anything additional without doing the TCO analysis. And the reason for that is once it's offshore, there's some one-time cost of bringing it back, moving tooling, moving people, et cetera. Second would be to reshore the outsourced products. So the products that you've outsourced to a machine shop, a foundry, a wire harness company, something rather offshore, look at those. Why? Because once your order with that company runs out, you can place an order with a domestic company. The transitional costs are not so bad. Third would be if you have your own offshore facility to supply, convert it from supplying, say, half to Asia, half to the US over 5 years, have it go up to 90% for Asia, 10% for the US, put your incremental investment here, just like you've been putting your incremental investment there for the last 10 or 20 years. And the toughest thing we know is to close the offshore facility, build a new US facility. So I'm not likely to suggest that to most companies. So there are some barriers to making this work. Companies have a culture, and typically the culture says offshore anything you can. Is the price lower? Get it going. Good companies have even decided that manufacturing is not a core competence. That's something for somebody else to do. We'll do the marketing and the finance and the management, the HR maybe, but manufacturing that's for other people. U.S. has a real problem with short-term thinking. The investments are not made for the long term. The way the Chinese, we hear about the 20-year plan and the 50-year perspective and so on. The reward system, typically the procurement person, the person who's actually making that day-to-day decision, is rewarded based on price, not based on total cost. And they're going to tend to do what creates their bonus, it creates their promotion. Some of the parts of the TCO system are subjective. It's hard. What is the intellectual property risk? That takes some judgment. It takes some time. The FOB price is probably in the ERP system, and many of these softer factors I described are not in the ERP system. There's silos where the procurement tends to optimize for price while ignoring the needs of quality, service, inventory control, engineering, et cetera. So there's a siloing effect that needs to be overcome. So I'm not saying this is easy, but I'm saying that in many cases it's doable. So when you get into this and you're at a company or your own company or another company, find allies, and there are natural allies. So most bigger companies these days have a lean champion, process optimization, continuous improvement people. They will understand that offshoring makes waste worse, and their job is to minimize waste and bring value to the customer. Most companies have taken very strong green positions, and it's clear that moving production from, especially China to the US, will result in less pollution, especially because the Chinese electricity is so dirty. Regulatory compliance, much more difficult to be sure over there than here. Quality issues, most of the recalls in the US have been Chinese products. The C-suite increasingly is thinking about how to take care of the stakeholders, where the Business Roundtable has announced that stakeholders now includes not just shareholders, but also the community, the employees, and the suppliers, and how better to take care of that constituency, those stakeholders, than to bring some of that work back and revitalize those groups. So another thing to think about is, if I were, when I'm promoting this within a company, I don't say, let's reshore. I say, let's reevaluate. Let's see if, let's say, I would say that the company has a responsibility to the state, to the community, to the country, to be willing to do the math and find out if it's in its interest, if it'll actually be more profitable if it decides to reshore. So way I'd go about it would be to select some suitable products or families, gather needed data, starting with allies, like I mentioned, run the TCO, implement a few clear winners, and then once you've got some champions, you've got some successes, then expand to bring in other groups. And when you find you're close, when you get the price differences like this, and you get the TCO down to about that, that's the time to apply lean, to apply training, to apply automation, to bring in the MEP, to get rid of that last 5%, whereas to get rid of 30% or 40% out of manufacturing costs, that's pretty tough. I think I mentioned this before, pain is important. So it's important to, when you're gathering those allies, when you're picking the products that you're going to put through the TCO system, to ask for the products where the system, where the culture is experiencing pain, where there's delivery issues, quality issues, late night telephone calls, et cetera. So there's just people that are suffering from these conditions, and they will support you in making this work. there's some considerations. Some things are easier than others. So for example, if you have a product that's machined from bar stock versus being cast or injection molded. So something that has a standard workpiece like bar stock and uses standard tooling, off-the-shelf tooling, that's pretty easy to move. Whereas if you have an injection mold or foundry tooling or something else that's similarly complex and expensive that way, sometimes it's very hard to get it back from the supplier in the other country. And you have to move it, and then the people you give it to are going to say it's no good, and you have to rework it. So again, start with the areas where you're likely to win. You have to make sure there's local capacity in terms of facilities and people. You probably don't want to mess around with something that's only $1,000 a year. You probably want to start with things that are 100,000 or $1 million a year. The Trump tariffs can make a big difference. Many of the Chinese products are at 25% now, and that 25% makes a huge difference in flipping the product into the U.S. Win category. It says you apply a logical process of working on the parts that you choose. The qualitative factors can be complex. We're working on a series of what I call mini spreadsheets, which will allow you to do, instead of guessing at what the IP risk is, to input a couple of factors that go into that in a spreadsheet that we will provide that'll help you come to a reasonable conclusion. And when you get done, look at the results, and if any are unreasonably high, like if the intellectual property risk in Germany turns out to be really high, then probably you made a mistake. Or if the quality risk from Switzerland is high, probably you made a mistake. Go back in and look at your inputs and see and make sure they're reasonable. Because if you're not reasonable, and in fact, if you're not ideally conservative in your calculation of the total cost, then the people you want to convince will not accept them. So here's a couple of examples. Hubbard Forge they're good friends of mine, and they're very high-end lighting systems, like fancy lamps to have at your house. And what they did, where the TCO estimator has maybe 28 factors in it, they instead cut that down so that they fixed most of those factors and left maybe 8 of them that they would change as they went between different products. And they'd come up with their analysis, and they found it did not make sense to bring back what was over there because their volumes aren't very big. But instead, when a new product was developed, they do the analysis to make the decision of whether to send it offshore or not. So this is an example of those mini spreadsheets that I described. So instead of just guessing at a number off at the right hand of that, instead a couple of reasonable assumptions that build up towards that. So the part of the logic is this is your company is now thinking about, should I offshore this product or should I make it here? And to make it here is going to take $500,000, maybe $1 million worth of investment. Should I do that? Well, if you look at a big price gap, say a 30-40% price gap, and you say, can I invest $1 million get enough productivity to get rid of that manufacturing cost gap and get a return on the $1 million I just invested? That's awfully hard. That's rarely going to happen unless you're horribly antiquated now. Whereas if you, instead of the 30% price gap, if you have a 5% TCO gap, because you've recognized all the costs and risks, now the possibility to get a really good return on the $1 million investment just went up. So now we're going to go to the TCO estimator. And to do this, I have to stop sharing, and then share. And hope that I haven't been timed out. Good. Okay, here we go. Share. Okay, so when you get to the You go to our website, www.reshorenow.org. You go to TCO estimator in the bar at the top. You open it up. The first time you go there, if you want to use it, you have to sign up, email address and password, and then you come back and you sign in. When you sign in, you get access to either filling out your own form, that's fine, or what I would suggest is looking at the sample form. And this is the sample form that's in there. So I'm going to take you through it, fairly quickly, because I know software demonstrations always make my eyes glaze over. I don't want yours to do that. Name for calculation, the flange, something like that. You'll see here, we do not ask you for your company name. We do not ask you for your name. And the reason we don't do that is because I believed when I wrote this that you'd be more likely to put in real honest data if you're not worried about it somehow being revealed to your competitors. And we've never revealed anything. We've guaranteed not to do that, but we do take your data and do the calculations, such as those charts that I showed you with the blue lines and the red lines. So up here, you answer, is this a real case or am I experimenting? So when I put this together, I was experimenting. It's important to answer that honestly and clearly, because we use the data and we assume your real cases are real cases. Which we ask, what is currently your source? Because we think it's interesting to know where you're starting from and where you're thinking of going to. Is this going to be in-house, in-house, like in your own factory, or is it going to be outsourced to somebody else and offshore and now? What industry are you in? Like transportation equipment, oil and gas, paper, things like that. Product description, as much as you're willing to give us. I'd like you to give me something, because then we can dig deeper in and do the analysis. I don't need your part number, if you're worried about that. And then you come down here and there's a input data factor. There's two countries, always the US, because that's who I wrote it for. And then the offshore, I think there's 30 countries in here you can choose from. And in this case, I chose China. And the reason I talk about China a lot during the presentation is that about 40% of all the reshoring has come from China. So China, that is, the dominant manufacturing force in the world today, has also been the primary source of reshoring of product coming back to the United States. So you pick a country, and that by picking that country, that's going to determine what the freight cost is to get the product back here. And specifically, the freight is figured to Chicago, just because I don't want to have it to 100 different cities in the United States, and Chicago is sort of central. You put in the FOB or ex-works price, the price at the factory door. Now over here you get explanations, and the purpose of the explanations is to help you understand what I'm looking for. Because if you don't put in things in the units, in the logic that the algorithm is expecting, like if you put in pounds instead of kilograms, or if you put in the price for a dozen instead of a unit or something like that, then the algorithm isn't going to come up with good answers at the end. So some are very obvious, like quantity. Others are maybe a little more complicated as we come through. Duty rate, if you don't identify it, we automatically put in 4%, but if you know the duty rate, could be zero. Coming from some countries, some products are zero. So put in whatever the duty rate is if you know what it is. The weight in pounds, fairly standard, obvious things. The weight of the packaging per unit, everything's per unit. And you up here somewhere, you define whether a unit is one piece, like a casting, or whether it's 1,000 pounds of chicken feed or something like that. The product life, and we ask for that because at the end of product life, well, during the product life, you have to amortize the cost of the prototype over the product life. And at the end of it, you have an obsolescence issue of what to do with the excess inventory that's left when the product is no longer viable. Similarly, for the supplier relationship, let's see what else is interesting here. Shipment time in months. How long does it take to get here? So for the US, we said 0.04. So 0.04 times 30 is about a day. That's the assumption in this one case. You put in whatever you believe is true. For China, we put in a month. A month today is optimistic. 5 to 6 weeks is more likely, especially if the product's coming from anywhere other than right on the coast. I read recently that about 45% of the product coming out of China to the US gets bumped. It doesn't get on the boat it was planned to get on because there aren't enough boats and not enough containers to get all the products in to get them over to the United States. Annual carrying costs while in transit, probably your cost of capital for the company. Annual carrying costs once it's in the warehouse. I've researched this fairly carefully, and most experts used to say 25%. Maybe they dropped that to 20 or 22% today because interest rates are so low. But most of the costs are other than interest rate. Most of the costs are obsolescence and having the warehouse and air conditioning, accounting, and rust and all that kind of thing. So a series of other interesting, I think interesting here, the delivery time from order to receipt. This is important because that's going to tell you how long you have product in inventory. And separately, we ask you what the payment terms are. So if you're paying before the product shipped, which is fairly common coming out of Asia, then you have your money tied up on, starting a month before you get it or 6 weeks before you get it. Whereas if you're paying a local US supplier, you're typically paying that supplier 30 days or 60 days or 90 days after you get it. So there's a difference of perhaps 2 or 3 months in your money being tied up. Now, doesn't seem too important in a time of low interest rates, but low interest rates will not be here forever. Quality differentials, if you can measure them. What percentage of the product is planned to be air freighted? So you can, because the air freight is 5 times or 10 times as high as the surface freight. Okay, well, IP risk, it can be very high if the product has significant IP and it's fairly new, or if it's an average bracket or something very simple, a screw, then there's not much IP risk. That's again why I think it's important to adjust all this or customize it to the product. You'll see throughout here we offer various sources, other people that have written on the subject. What's the extent of intellectual property theft, et cetera, so you can get some background to make an informed decision. Let's see here. Again, just more of the same. Purchasing costs, some estimate of purchasing cost other than travel. I've had people tell me that there's more time invested by the procurement people dealing with something they're buying out of China or India than there is if they're buying it from down the street. And how much is that? Well, that's up for you to decide. Wage inflation in the other country. This is very important, especially to look at the longer term horizon. Currency appreciation, what's forecast? Hard to do. If we knew how to do that, we'd be on Wall Street. But at least China currency has significantly appreciated over the last, let's say, 10 years, 15 years. And for example, one would expect it to continue to. The dollar seems to be in a decline for the last couple of months. Most people expect the dollar to continue down, which means you'd expect the currency of the other country for most other countries to continue up. So you answer all these questions. And if you cannot answer something, you say, Harry, I just don't want to answer that question, then don't answer it. And so the result will be something won't be calculated in the results, but you fill it out, you save it, because you can come back and revise it, and then you complete and view results. And that takes you over to the results page, where we have the cost factors, which are factors that were calculated using the algorithms and using the inputs that you put into the input page. The same 2 countries that you identified, the US and let's say the other country you identified, same price, for example, came through. And then this is a formula. And it says, for example, what's the duty in dollars per part? Well, it's the duty rate or duty percentage, in this case, it was 4%, and the price, which was 70, so 4 times 70 is amazingly $2.80, which it says here. So I very carefully put all of these factors in here with formulas in words, the equivalent of the formulas you see in Excel, like AB times 3 times the square root of 5x or whatever, Excel's in Excel. And I did that so that you would feel comfortable, and so that anybody you're trying to convince about this will feel comfortable. If I get someone who's disagreeing, he says, Harry, I don't believe the numbers. I say, do you accept the formula that I've written here? Yes. I say, do you accept the inputs that that we put in on the input page? Yes. Check a couple of the numbers on this page and see if the formula is properly applied to the inputs we put in on the other page. Okay, they're all good. I said, then I think you have to accept that the end conclusion is correct. And so far that seems to have worked. So this is the various costs and risks. And remember that chart that I showed you where the lines that were going like this, and for the US and for the other country. And it started with the price on the left and increasingly less firm factors were added in going to the right. So this is where that comes from. So here's the price, and then the cost of goods sold. So there's the sum of the cost of goods sold. And then other hard costs that were added in, and coming up with the sum of all of those. And then the cumulative total, which is the price plus the other firm costs, and then the various risks calculated, the strategic impacts. Now, green, I've never put in formulas for green, and maybe I should have, but the experts never quite decide what a ton of CO2 is worth. But especially if your company really is proud of green and its green initiatives, most studies say that something like 80% of the environmental impact of bigger companies occurs in their supply chain, not inside their own facilities. And so if the company is bragging about its green achievements but ignoring 80% of the impact, then that's wrong. And one way to get them to do that would be to use this and estimate those impacts from offshore. I may have mentioned last time we did a study of a 2-pound aluminum die casting and compared making it in China and shipping it here versus making it here. And the CO2 impact on the world environment was 25 to 50% less by doing it here instead of making it there and importing it. So so this comes out again with a chart like more or less like the one that I showed you before. And then that other chart that shows the starting on the left with the firm things and adding the more subjective things coming off to the right. Okay, so that's the TCO estimator. It's most of it's very straightforward, very easy. You have to do some homework, gathering data, in some cases gathering opinions. We're working on those mini spreadsheets, and when they're available, that'll help make those opinions a little firmer for you. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to share again and go back to the thing. I hope this works. And see, has that come up on the screen? A slide?
Yeah, we've got it.
Okay, good. It's good when these things work. So the one thing I just skipped over there, this was the import substitution program that we offer. So companies like maybe those who are listening can identify a product that they make that they're really good at making, a widget of some kind. And with this program, we can tell you who the biggest importers are. That's the consignee, the company to which the product is consigned or shipped. The address, what the product is, tons per year, some idea of what they're paying for it, whom they're buying it from offshore. And then your company would use the TCO estimator to convince that big company that the company would be more profitable buying from you instead of continuing to import. So delighted to work with companies to do that. This is just for fun, I think, but I think it's got a message that U.S. manufacturing output is about 2.4 trillion per year, and the goods imported, adjusted for the price difference, are about 3.2 trillion. So we import more goods than we produce. And so if your company, when you're out looking for work, is mainly competing with other U.S. producers to sell to people who are primarily buying from U.S. producers, then you're missing out on selling to all the companies that are buying imports. And those imports are, as you can see, about 33% or 133% of the U.S. value. We're 33% bigger. So I show the two dogs fighting over a bone when there's a nice steak waiting back there. That and all of them won't be steaks. Some are going to be pretty stringy pieces of maybe a bone or something. But there's some good steak back there that if you go out of your way and look for it, that we believe you'll find it. We can help you do that. So so we're a nonprofit. We've got 31 sponsors, a great variety of manufacturing trade associations, publications, companies, just all kinds of groups, utilities that support us, and we're honored to have all these groups support us in making this happen. So with that, okay, Sanju.
Yes, thank you, Harry. I want to thank you especially for doing this presentation today. I know you've been a proponent of reshoring for so many years, and there hasn't been much interest. Only recently we've seen some interest pick up in this area.
Well, Sanju, just let me just say that
Yes.
as I pointed out with that one chart, it's gone from 6,000 jobs announced in 2010 to 190,000 announced in 2017. So
Wow.
it's gotten, but I want it to get to 500,000 per year.
Yes.
And that's what we
Yes.
can all do together.
And I do recall a few years back when you started this, there really wasn't that much notice paid to you. And then COVID-19 really brought everything to the surface. So it's really been a wake-up call to most manufacturers. So thank you very much. And thanks to you, we have these tools and resources already prepared for us. So manufacturers don't have to start from scratch. So appreciate that. I also want to thank GHP, Greater Houston Partnership, Carrie, Sarah, and your team. You've been wonderful working with and bringing this presentation and this webinar. Hopefully we can do many more. Before we go to question and answers for this session, I want to share a few useful links for the audience. So let's look at the first one. That is really a link to our website, support and assistance to US manufacturers. Harry, would you? Yes, thank you. So this link is to our online short courses. We provide these and many other cost saving and operational improvement services to manufacturers. If you're a US manufacturer, you need our assistance with anything you can imagine business related, just reach out to us. We have all the resources. We have, as I said, 51 centers in the US with many sub-centers all over the country. And the second link, we have access costs everywhere, which is called the ACE tool. This site provides you with a very thorough and in-depth analysis of all components of total cost of operating overseas. So I know Harry mentioned some of the aspects of cost of operating overseas, but this really has a very detailed analytical presentation of all the costs and components. I urge you to go take a look. They have some case studies that will be also very useful to you. And then there's the cost differential frontier. This is developed by the University of Lausanne. This site provides a calculator to determine the real value of producing close to demand. We're talking shorter physical distance. And this tool takes into consideration the volatility you see in demand forecast, and it helps you answer this specific question: how much cheaper does a long lead time supplier need to be to compensate for the increase in demand volatility exposure? So that's another very useful tool. The remaining three links, go ahead and click through those three, Harry. These Harry has already presented. They are from his reshoring initiative. website, the total cost of ownership, the skilled workforce information on that, and the import substitution program that he already shared with us. And Sarah, would you please copy these links and put them in the chat box so the audience can access them and pursue those links. So we'll leave this next slide with the contact information on the screen as we take questions from the audience.
Great, thank you, Harry and Sanju. Really appreciate your presentations again today. We do have some questions from our audience, and I know that several folks have put their questions in the chat feature and may have had their questions answered there. But I might reiterate one of those being investors. Harry, perhaps, or Sanju, you can answer the question about how to convince an investor of going for a total cost model versus the cheapest. And obviously those decisions are made by several people, not just the supplier or the OEM. So again, it's very hard to convince, and maybe it's a culture. But what are some of your recommendations?
I've spoken several times to private equity firms, private equity conferences, which is investors trying to think what company to buy. And I point out to them that since most companies ignore total cost and look only at price, they have not optimized. And the role of the investor should be not to pay $2 for something that's worth $2, but to pay $2 for something that when that company is appropriately, reasonably changed, it's worth $3 or $4. And therefore the inefficiencies, the sub-optimization that's made by looking only at price and not at total cost create opportunities. Now, what I wouldn't blindly accept it. I'd look at the numbers, I'd look at the calculation, I'd make sure it made sense. If necessary, I would, if it was in appliances, let's say, I'd come to our website and on our library advanced search, look up appliances and look for all the cases of reshoring where appliances actually succeeded. And then, well, it worked for GE and it worked for Whirlpool and it worked for Somever. I guess it might work for us if we did it. I think that's worth pursuing. And if nothing else works, call me and let me help.
Great. It comes down to a little bit of marketing as well, right? I mean, the Made in America or Buy America, there is something appealing about that at certain levels. So we have a question from Aman. He's asking.
I'd like to add to that.
Okay.
Gary. Sorry. So I was just going to say, at the end of the day, money talks, the numbers talk. So you really don't have to convince somebody if they're looking at the numbers. So the hard items are easy to quantify, the tariffs and so on, but there are the soft issues that Harry brought up, the intellectual property, the value of that, and different soft issues, language barriers, the delays due to that, the conversion to different units and so on, that cause confusion and delay, and it costs you something. You may not be able to quantify it, but if you can get a best estimate or just look at historical case studies, then you can make a decision. So just show them the numbers, show them the money.
Great, thank you. Thanks for adding that. Aman has a question, and I know that came up in one of your slides, Harry, but let me go ahead and ask it for the audience. When discussing price, should we focus on the cost of the product or focus on the cost of getting the product to the customer? My understanding is that is your total cost, right?
It depends on whether the product is a product, like a refrigerator, or it's a valve that goes into the refrigerator, which doesn't exactly go to the customer, it goes to the factory. I say you want to start with the FOB price and add in all the other factors that you agree are reasonable to get to the total cost, but including the impact of the two sources on things that stretch all the way out to that customer. So the warranty costs, if there's a differential in quality and therefore warranty costs, if there's a difference in availability, like there's like the chips now into the automobiles that aren't being produced. If you're losing millions of dollars of orders because you can't get the components because they can't get out of China to get here. Well, those are valid factors that influence your P&L and maybe cause you to lose that customer that's essential for your future.
Thank you. Sanju, anything else, or that
I'm sorry,
Harry answer it?
I was answering a question on the
No, you're fine. You're fine. I didn't want to leave you out this time. Okay, so we have a question or comment really from Joe Kelly, and trying to think of how to word this. Clearly, there was an incentive for companies in the 70s and 80s to move offshore. Manufacturing at a time was more labor intensive. Now that we're automating, now that so much more of our manufacturing industry is automated, we need to talk about job creation and what the reality of job creation is, because there is a perception that if you reshore or you bring things here, that we will be creating lots and lots of manufacturing jobs. What are those opportunities for job creation, and really what is the right way of saying that? Because it's not as if you're bringing some of those jobs are going to be gone, right?
Well, I think the best way to look at it is that if you offshored the work 20 years ago, you will not bring the work back and put it in the same factory with the same equipment, with the same productivity as it was when it left 20 years ago. So the productivity of all the US is up by 30% or something since then, and therefore you would expect at least that change to happen. But the real important thing that I want people to remember is that the US is not an island. That we have, last year we had $918 billion trade deficit with the rest of the world. And that represents, at current levels of US productivity, 5 or 6 million US manufacturing jobs at current levels of productivity. So we can, just to put it simply, the US will lose more jobs to Chinese automation if we do not automate than we will to US automation if we do. If we don't automate, we'll continue to lose millions of jobs to China. If we do automate, we can stop the loss and eventually turn that around and bring back what today would be 5 million, but maybe 10 years from now will be 3 million, but it's still 3 million jobs more than we have now, and maybe 6 or 7 million more than we'd have if we didn't automate and allowed the Chinese to continue to automate. So I think it's clear we can have more jobs, we can have higher pay, we can have higher productivity all together as long as we're smart and we automate, we use TCO, we do lean, all the things that Sanju can help them with.
Yes, and Harry, you hit upon it very pointedly. When we talk about automation in the US, we forget that other countries can also automate at the same time. We are assuming that we're trying to automate here and they have manual labor there, but no, it can happen both ways. So we need to also automate and be prepared. Otherwise, there's no way we can compete with them.
Great. Well, I do know that we're over the witching hour, which is 1 o'clock. I really appreciate Sanju and Harry's time today. Last week as well, a 2-part series. So very much appreciate you spending that time. I'm going to ask Sarah to pull up a poll really quickly. If you have time and you're still with us, and if you can answer that, that would be wonderful. But thank you so much. We would love to have you join us for future Business Beyond Border programming or other programming with the Greater Houston Partnership. And you can visit us at houston.org/events, or just get in touch with us at the Greater Houston Partnership at member.engagement@houston.org. That was in your chat. And again, great topic. We will be talking more about COVID-19 and the future of work and the workplace shortly, because we're coming up a year, at least in Houston, talking about everything related to COVID-19. So join us for those sessions. Again, we'll be launching those in March. So stay tuned. Thank you, Sanju, Harry. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Great. Thanks for coming.